Sir, you need to leave this area immediately. This section is reserved for first-class passengers, not for people like you.
Sir, you need to leave this lounge immediately. The woman's voice sliced through the quiet atmosphere of the first-class lounge at Denver International Airport. Conversation slowed. A spoon froze halfway to a coffee cup. Several passengers looked up from their laptops. The man she was speaking to sat near the floor-to-ceiling windows, overlooking the runway glowing under the late afternoon sun. He was a black man, around 40 years old, gray running shorts, a dark blue athletic shirt still marked with dried sweat, white running shoes stained with road dust, a black gym bag resting beside his chair. Around his neck hung a Denver Marathon medal from earlier that morning, completely out of place among designer luggage, tailored suits, and polished leather shoes. The woman standing over him was Ashley Morgan, supervisor for Skylink Airline's Premium Terminal Lounge, 36 years old, blonde hair pulled into a tight bun, silver supervisor badge clipped neatly to her blazer. Ashley crossed her arms. This section is reserved for premium passengers, not people wandering in from the public terminal. The man slowly lifted his eyes toward her. No anger, no embarrassment. Just a calm, controlled stillness that somehow made Ashley more uncomfortable. "I'm a first-class passenger," he said quietly. "Flight 447 to Atlanta. Seat 2A. Ashley gave a thin smile. The kind people wear when they already believe they know exactly who you are. "Then show me your boarding pass." The man reached into his gym bag and handed her the ticket. Ashley checked it carefully. It was real. Ethan Brooks. First class. Priority access. Everything verified. But her expression never changed, because the ticket had never really been the problem. Ashley looked down at Ethan's dusty running shoes, then glanced around at the watching passengers. "We've had incidents before," she announced louder this time. "People using stolen cards, fake upgrades, lounge fraud." A couple sitting nearby exchanged uncomfortable looks. A businessman slowly lowered his phone onto the table. The energy inside the lounge shifted instantly. Ethan stayed seated, hands resting calmly on his knees, breathing steady, eyes focused. That composure irritated Ashley more than resistance would have. At that moment, Brian Cooper arrived, airport security, 45 years old, broad shoulders, former police officer posture, close-cropped gray hair. He approached with the heavy confidence of someone used to being obeyed. "Problem here?" Ashley handed him the boarding pass without taking her eyes off Ethan. "This gentleman claims he belongs in the premium lounge." Brian looked Ethan up and down. Running clothes, sweat stains, cheap gym bag. In his mind, the equation solved itself immediately. "Sir, I'll need additional identification." Ethan looked up. "Additional identification for what?" "For verification," Brian answered stiffly. "Verification of what exactly?" A brief silence settled over the lounge. Because sometimes the real reason people question someone is the one thing they cannot say out loud. Ashley stepped in before Brian could answer. "You're dressed inappropriately for this environment." The words landed hard. A flight attendant near the coffee station slowly looked up. A woman in a navy business suit lowered her Wall Street Journal. That sentence was no longer policy. It was judgment. Ethan studied Ashley for a moment. Then he asked quietly, "What exactly about my appearance makes you think I don't belong here?" Ashley froze for half a second. It was a dangerous question, because it forced her to confront the thought sitting underneath all of this. She could not say, "Because we're black," so she reached for something safer. "This is a premium space. We maintain standards." "Standards?" Ethan repeated softly. "Can you show me the written dress code?" Brian's patience began slipping. "Sir, don't make this difficult." Ethan tilted his head slightly. "I'm not the one making this difficult." Across the lounge, a young man quietly lifted his phone and started recording. His name was Dylan Parker, 21 years old, journalism student, University of Colorado. At first, Dylan thought this was just another boarding issue. Now he realized it was something else entirely, something America had seen too many times before. A black man being forced to prove he deserved to exist in a space he had already paid to enter. Dylan started a live stream. Comments flooded the screen almost immediately. "What's happening? Keep recording. This feels wrong." Meanwhile, Ethan never stood up. never raised his voice, never argued, and somehow that made Ashley even more irritated. She was used to people reacting one of two ways, either submission or anger. Ethan chose neither. He stayed calm, and he let them keep talking. Brian crossed his arms. "Sir, if you refuse to cooperate, we may have to escort you out." A woman sitting near the window finally stood up, around 50 years old, navy suit, medical conference badge still hanging around her neck. "I've been sitting here for almost 40 minutes, she said firmly. "That man hasn't bothered anyone." Ashley turned toward her. "Mom, this is a security matter." The woman looked directly at her. "No, this is a dignity matter." The lounge fell silent again. Outside the massive windows, runway lights slowly flickered on as evening settled over Denver. And inside the lounge, something else was beginning to ignite. Not just tension, something bigger. The uncomfortable realization spreading quietly through the room that everyone might be underestimating the man sitting calmly in that leather chair. The woman in the navy suit did not sit back down. Her name was Dr. Laura Bennett, and she had spent 30 years in hospital rooms where panic had to be handled with calm hands and clear judgment. She knew the difference between a real threat and a person being made into one. Ashley stared at her like she had broken some unspoken rule. "Mom," Ashley said, her voice tight, "I need you to return to your seat." Laura folded the newspaper in her hand and placed it on the table beside her. "I will sit down when this gentleman is treated like every other passenger in this room." A few heads turned, not quickly, slowly. The way people move when their conscience has finally become louder than their comfort. Brian Cooper's jaw tightened. He shifted his weight and touched the radio clip to his shoulder, not using it yet, just letting everyone see it was there. "Sir," Brian said to Ethan, "this can be resolved easily. Show additional identification, answer a few questions, and we can verify whether you're authorized to remain here." Ethan looked at him for a long second. "I already showed a valid boarding pass. We need more than that. Do you ask every first-class passenger for more than that?" Brian blinked once. Ashley stepped forward. "Don't turn this into something it isn't." Ethan's eyes moved to her. "What is it then?" The question was soft, too soft. It landed harder because of that. Ashley's lips pressed into a thin line. She glanced around and noticed phones, more than one now. Dylan Parker was not the only person recording. A man in a gray sport coat had his phone resting against a coffee cup. An older woman near the window had opened her camera app and was holding it low against her purse. Ashley felt the room slipping away from her. She had worked 8 years to get that badge. She knew schedules, upgrades, complaints, weather delays, gate changes. She knew how to calm angry travelers and how to flatter wealthy ones. But she had never learned what to do when the person she had judged refused to become the version of himself she needed him to be. Angry, loud, threatening. Ethan gave her none of that. He gave her only facts. Brian leaned closer. "Sir, stand up and bring your belongings with you." Ethan did not move. "Am I being detained?" That stopped Brian. A small sound came from somewhere behind them. A breath, a chair shifting. Someone understood the weight of the question. Brian's voice hardened. "You are being asked to comply with security screening."
"What screening?"
"Verification. Based on what suspicion?" Brian's face reddened slightly. Ashley answered for him. "Based on your behavior." Ethan looked around the lounge.
"My behavior?"
He raised one hand, palm open, calm and steady. "I've been sitting in a chair, waiting for my flight. I answered your questions. I showed my ticket. I did not raise my voice. I did not threaten anyone. So tell me, Ashley, what behavior?" The use of her first name made her stiffen. Behind the counter, another employee had been watching from the beginning. Isabella Torres, 29 years old, gate agent, daughter of a school custodian and a night shift nurse from Albuquerque. She knew what it felt like to be judged by a uniform, an accent, a last name. She knew what it felt like when people smiled at policy but meant power. She had tried to stay behind the counter. She had tried to tell herself a supervisor would fix it, but no supervisor was fixing it. Ashley was the supervisor. Isabella stepped out from behind the counter. "Ashley," she said. Ashley turned sharply. "Not now." Isabella swallowed. Her hand trembled, but she kept walking. "His pass is valid. I checked it when he came in." Ashley's eyes flashed. "Return to your station. He is listed for flight 447, seat 2A, full fare first class. lounge access included. The lounge went quiet again, but this time the silence had changed. It was no longer confusion, it was recognition. Brian looked at Ashley. Ashley looked at Isabella. Ethan looked at neither of them. His gaze moved briefly to Isabella, and something in his expression softened. Not gratitude exactly, recognition. The quiet acknowledgement of someone who had chosen risk over silence. Ashley lowered her voice. Isabella, you are crossing a line. Isabella's eyes shone, but she did not back away. No, I think we crossed it when we made a paying passenger prove he deserved basic respect. Dylan's live stream comments began moving so fast, his phone could barely keep up. He whispered into the microphones, trying to keep his voice steady. She just confirmed his ticket is real. The gate agent just confirmed it. They still won't let this go. Across the lounge, a white man in his late 60s slowly stood. He wore a brown leather jacket and carried himself like someone who had flown too many miles and seen too many small cruelties go unnamed. I've been in this lounge since noon, he said. Nobody asked me for anything except my boarding pass. Brian turned toward him. Sir, please stay out of this. The man shook his head. No, I should have spoken sooner. That sentence carried weight. It moved through the room like a confession. Ethan heard it. Laura heard it. Isabella heard it. Even Ashley heard it, though she refused to let it touch her. Brian finally pressed his radio. Need additional security at the premium lounge near gate B47. Possible non-compliant passenger. Laura stepped closer. He is not non-compliant. He is being profiled. Ashley snapped, that's enough. But it was not enough. Not anymore. Because once people start telling the truth out loud, control becomes harder to fake. Ethan slowly reached into his gym bag. Brian's hand moved toward his belt.
Keep your hands visible.
Ethan paused, then looked up at him. I'm taking out my identification. His voice was even, almost tired, not frightened, not surprised, tired. The kind of tired carried by people who have had to stay calm their whole lives, so others could feel safe around their dignity. He removed his wallet and placed it on the table. Then he stopped. His phone buzzed once inside the bag, then again, then again. Ashley noticed. Who is contacting you? Ethan looked at the phone, then back at her. No one you need to worry about yet. The word yet changed the air. Ashley heard it. Brian heard it. Dylan heard it. And for the first time, a small crack appeared in Ashley Morgan's confidence. Because Ethan Brooks was not behaving like a man afraid of being exposed. He was behaving like a man waiting for the right moment to reveal what everyone else had failed to see. Ashley Morgan could feel the room turning against her. Not loudly, not dramatically, quietly. That was what made it worse. People were no longer looking at Ethan Brooks with suspicion. They were looking at her, and she hated that feeling. Sir, Brian Cooper said, forcing authority back into his voice, I'm asking one final time. Stand up and come with us. Ethan slowly picked up his phone from the table. The screen lit briefly across his face. 3 missed calls. 1 text message. He read it without reacting. Then he placed the phone back down carefully. No, the word landed softly. But it changed everything. Brian's shoulders stiffened immediately. You are refusing a lawful security request? I am refusing an unlawful one. A murmur moved across the lounge. Several passengers exchanged looks. Ashley stepped closer. Do you understand we can remove you from this terminal? Ethan looked up at her. Do you understand what happens if you do? That answer hit harder than either of them expected. Not because of the words, because of how calmly he said them. No bluff, no panic, no hesitation. Dylan Parker's live stream viewer count jumped again. 10,000, then 12,000. Comments flooded faster than he could read them. This guy knows something. Keep recording. They're digging their own graves. Dylan swallowed hard and adjusted the angle of his phone. He had started recording because something felt unfair. Now it felt dangerous, not physically dangerous, career dangerous, legal dangerous. The kind of moment people replay in courtrooms and board meetings. Near the coffee station, a flight attendant whispered to another employee.
Who is this guy?
Nobody knew. That uncertainty started spreading through the room like smoke. Brian reached for Ethan's duffel bag. I need to inspect this. Ethan's voice sharpened for the first time. Don't touch my property without cause. Brian froze for half a second. Then Ashley jumped in again. You're escalating this. No, Ethan replied. You escalated the moment you decided I didn't belong here. Silence. Heavy silence. The older businessman in the leather jacket slowly nodded to himself. Doctor. Laura Bennett folded her arms tighter across her chest. Even Isabella Torres looked shaken now, not by Ethan, by the realization that nobody in authority seemed willing to stop. Ashley's face had become flushed beneath the airport lights. She could still recover this. At least that was what she kept telling herself. If Ethan stood up, if he just left quietly, if the live stream ended, then maybe this would disappear. But Ethan Brooks was no longer behaving like a man trying to avoid attention. He was letting them expose themselves. One sentence at a time. Brian pressed his radio again. Needs supervisor assistance at Premium Lounge immediately. A crackling voice answered back. Copy that. Ashley exhaled slowly, relieved backup was coming. Then she turned back toward Ethan. You know what I think? She said quietly. Several people nearby immediately looked up again, because there was something different in her tone now. Personal. Dangerous. Ashley stared directly at Ethan's marathon medal hanging against his chest. I think you walked in here expecting people to feel sorry for you. Dylan's eyes widened behind his phone. Dr. Laura Bennett actually took a step forward. Ethan did not move. Ashley continued. You come in sweating, dressed like you slept in your car, carrying a gym bag into a luxury lounge, then act offended when security asked questions. Every word made the room colder. The businessman near the window muttered under his breath, Jesus Christ. Brian glanced sideways at Ashley. Even he realized she had crossed into territory that could not be defended anymore. But Ashley could not stop, because deep down, embarrassment had already started turning into desperation. Ethan looked at her carefully, almost sadly. Then he asked the question she least wanted to hear. If I looked different, would we still be having this conversation? Ashley immediately answered too quickly.
This has nothing to do with race. Then what does it have to do with?
Ashley opened her mouth. Nothing came out, because every possible answer sounded ugly once spoken aloud. The lounge doors opened suddenly. Another airport officer entered. Officer Daniel Ruiz, 50 years old, airport police, calm eyes, slow movements. A man who had spent decades learning that the loudest person in a conflict was rarely the one telling the truth. Ruiz surveyed the room immediately. Phones recording, passengers standing, security tense. One seated man remaining completely calm, his instincts activated instantly. What's going on? Brian answered first. Passenger refusing security cooperation. Ruiz looked at Ethan. What exactly are you refusing, sir? Ethan met his eyes. I showed my boarding pass, my identification. I answered questions. I have committed no crime. They want me removed because they believe I don't belong in this lounge. Ruiz looked toward Ashley. Ashley folded her arms again. He's being disruptive. Ruiz scanned the room. Nobody looked frightened of Ethan. Nobody looked threatened. If anything, the room looked protective of him. Dr. Laura Bennett spoke before Ashley could continue. That man has remained calm for over 30 minutes while being publicly humiliated. The businessman added quietly, you should probably ask why everyone here is filming. Ruiz noticed the phones then. Dozens now, and not hidden anymore. Openly recording. Dylan's live stream had crossed 15,000 viewers. Someone in the comments had already identified Skylink Airlines. Another person posted the corporate office number. Another tagged local news stations. Ruiz felt a slow pressure building behind his ribs. This was no longer just an airport disagreement. This was becoming public. National public. He crouched slightly beside Ethan. Sir, Ruiz said quietly, do you have identification on you? Ethan nodded once, then he slowly reached into his wallet. Brian shifted uneasily. Ashley watched with folded arms, still trying to hold on to certainty. Ethan removed a black card holder, not a cheap wallet, Italian leather, minimal, elegant. He opened it calmly, then paused. The room seemed to lean forward all at once. Even the airport sounds outside felt distant now. Rolling suitcases, boarding announcements, jet engines. Everything faded beneath the tension building around that small black card holder resting in Ethan Brooks's hands. Then Ethan looked directly at Ashley Morgan and finally spoke the sentence that made the first crack of fear appear in her eyes. You should have stopped this 20 minutes ago. Ashley Morgan did not answer. For the first time since the confrontation began, She looked less like a supervisor and more like a woman, realizing the floor beneath her was not as solid as she thought. Ethan Brooks held the black card holder in one hand, but he did not open it all the way yet. He let the silence stretch, not for drama, not for revenge, for clarity. Officer Daniel Ruiz noticed that. He had seen angry passengers throw status cards at employees. He had seen wealthy people threaten lawsuits before their boarding group was even called. But Ethan was different. He was not trying to frighten anyone with money. He was trying to make them say the truth before money entered the room. Ruiz lowered his voice. Mr. Brooks, I want to be clear. At this moment, you are not under arrest. You are not being detained. I'm trying to understand why this escalated. Brian Cooper's head snapped toward him. Daniel, he refused security instructions. Ruiz turned slowly. What specific instruction? Brian's mouth tightened. He refused to come with us. Come with you where? For verification. Verification of what? Brian's eyes hardened.
You know how this works.
No, Ruiz said. I know how policy works. I'm asking what policy you're enforcing. That sentence changed the room again. Ashley felt it. Brian felt it. So did Dylan Parker, whose phone was still raised, his thumb trembling near the edge of the screen as the live stream count kept climbing. The number had passed 20,000 now. He was no longer whispering. He was barely breathing. A woman in the comments wrote, "That officer is asking the right question." Another wrote, "Policy without a policy is discrimination." Dylan read that line and felt it settle in his chest. Policy without a policy is discrimination. Inside the lounge, Isabella Torres stood near the counter, with her hands clasped so tightly her knuckles had turned pale. She knew what Ashley could do to her schedule, her evaluations, her future. She had a mother still paying medical bills and a younger brother in community college. She could not afford to lose her job. But she also knew something her parents had taught her long before she ever wore an airline badge. A paycheck was important. A conscience was heavier. Ashley suddenly pointed toward Isabella. This employee has inserted herself into a security matter without authority. Isabella's eyes flickered, just once. Then she steadied. I inserted the truth. A soft sound moved through the lounge. Not applause, not yet, just breath. The kind people release when someone says what they were afraid to say. Ashley's cheeks flushed deeper. Enough. This is becoming disruptive to our premium guests. The older man in the brown leather jacket stepped forward again. His name was Walter Hayes, a retired high school principal from Kansas City. He had spent 4 decades watching children learn who they were by the way adults treated them. He had seen boys shrink under suspicion. He had seen girls go quiet after being dismissed. He knew how dignity could be damaged in public. He looked at Ashley, not with anger, but with disappointment. Mom, I am one of your premium guests. And what is making me uncomfortable is not him. Ashley turned on him. Sir, please don't interfere. Walter's jaw moved slowly. I interfered too late. Those words hit Laura Bennett harder than she expected. She lowered her phone for a moment. In hospitals, she had often seen families regret waiting too long to speak, too long to question, too long to demand better. Now she was watching a room full of people learn the same lesson in real time. Brian took one step toward Ethan. Mr. Brooks, last chance. Stand up. Ethan looked down at the business card still inside the holder. Then he closed it. Everyone expected him to reveal it. He did not. Instead, he looked at Brian. You still don't know who I am. That means this is still the cleanest moment you have to do the right thing. Brian frowned. What is that supposed to mean? It means you can stop before my name changes how you treat me. Silence. Sharp. Clean. Even Ashley stopped breathing for half a second. Ethan continued, voice low. If I have to prove I'm important before you treat me like a human being, then the problem is bigger than this lounge. The words moved slowly through the room. They were not loud. They did not need to be. A man near the bar lowered his head. A woman by the window wiped at one eye, not because the speech was sentimental, because it was true. And truth, when spoken calmly in a room built on comfort, can feel like a door opening to cold air. Officer Ruiz nodded once, almost to himself. Then his radio crackled. Supervisor en route to Premium Lounge. ETA 2 minutes. Ashley grabbed onto that like a lifeline. Good. Maybe now we'll get this handled properly. Ruiz looked at her. It should have been handled properly when he showed the boarding pass. Ashley's eyes flashed. You don't work for Skylink. No, Ruiz said. I work for the law. That sentence landed hard enough to make Brian look away. Ethan's phone buzzed again. This time, the screen lit long enough for Dylan's camera to catch a name. Rachel H. Dylan did not know who Rachel was, but Ethan saw the message, and a brief change passed through his face. Not surprise, confirmation. He opened it. The message was short. Jet crew on standby. Legal aware. Want me to contact Midland Regional? Ethan typed with his thumb. Not yet. Then another message came in. Your live stream is already being shared.
Please confirm you are safe.
Ethan looked at the crowd, at Ashley, at Brian, at Officer Ruiz, at Isabella, standing with fear in her eyes and courage in her posture. Then he typed, I am safe. Others are speaking up. For the first time, his face softened, because that mattered more to him than they knew. Power could protect him. Money could move people. Contracts could make executives call back. But none of that healed the old wound of standing in a room where people decided you were less before they knew a single thing about you. What eased that wound, even slightly, was hearing ordinary people say, no, not this time. The lounge doors opened again. A woman in her 50s entered with a fast, controlled walk. Janet Collins, terminal operations manager. Silver hair cut to her jaw, black blazer, tablet in hand, a face trained by years of delays, storms, complaints, and corporate emergencies. But when she saw the phones, the crowd, the security officers, and the black man in running clothes sitting calmly at the center of it all, her expression tightened. She knew at once. This was no ordinary complaint. This was already bigger than her. Ashley hurried toward her. Janet, thank God. We have a passenger who gained access to the premium lounge under questionable circumstances and refuses to cooperate with security. Janet looked at Ethan, then at the boarding pass on the table, then at Isabella. Is his ticket valid? Isabella answered before Ashley could stop her.
Yes.
Janet's eyes moved back to Ashley. Is his lounge access valid? Yes, Isabella said again. Full first-class access. Flight 447. Seat 2A. Janet's face became very still. Ashley rushed in, but his appearance raised concerns. The entire lounge seemed to freeze around that sentence. Janet slowly turned toward Ashley. His appearance? Ashley realized too late how it sounded. Brian stepped in. We were maintaining standards. Ruiz said quietly, they have not identified a written standard. Janet inhaled through her nose, slowly, the kind of breath taken by someone watching a lawsuit form in real time. Ethan finally stood. Not fast, not aggressive. He rose to his full height, the marathon medal catching the warm light from the windows. His shoulders were relaxed. His eyes were calm. But the room felt the shift immediately. He was not just a passenger anymore. He was a man who had allowed them every chance to choose decency, and they had chosen pride. Ethan opened a black card holder. He removed one card. Then he placed it on the table in front of Janet Collins. My name is Ethan Brooks, he said. And before anyone reads that card, I want this understood clearly. He looked at Ashley, then Brian, then the cameras. What happened here was wrong before you knew who I was. Janet Collins stared at the card on the table without touching it. The room felt suspended, like everyone inside the lounge understood that whatever was printed on that small piece of black card was about to change everything. Ashley Morgan folded her arms tighter, still trying to hold on to control. Brian Cooper stood stiff beside her, though the confidence had started leaking out of his posture minutes ago. Officer Daniel Ruiz remained silent, watching, measuring, waiting. Janet finally picked up the card. Her eyes moved across the lettering once, then again. The color drained slowly from her face. Not dramatically, quietly. The way fierce enters professionals who suddenly realize they have walked into something far larger than themselves. Her lips parted slightly. Brooks Global Freight, Chief Executive Officer, Ethan Brooks. Janet looked up at Ethan immediately, this time not with suspicion. Recognition, real recognition, the kind that comes from boardroom emails, transportation conferences, and corporate partnerships worth hundreds of millions of dollars. Ashley noticed the change instantly.
What?
She asked. What is it? Janet did not answer right away, because in that moment her mind was racing through consequences. Skylink Airlines had been negotiating a major regional cargo contract for almost a year. Everyone in upper management knew the name Brooks Global Freight. Everyone. Ashley took a step closer.
Janet,
Janet lowered the card carefully. Then she looked directly at Ethan.
Mr. Brooks,
I apologize for what has happened here. The entire lounge went still. Ashley blinked. Brian frowned. Dylan Parker nearly dropped his phone. The live stream exploded. Oh my God, I knew it. Who is he? They messed with the wrong person. But Ethan's expression did not change. That was the part unsettling everyone most now. He did not look satisfied. He did not look triumphant. He looked tired. Tired in a way older passengers in the room understood immediately. The exhaustion of a man who had spent his life proving he belonged in rooms where nobody questioned lesser men. Ashley laughed nervously. Wait, what exactly is going on? Janet turned toward her slowly. You need to stop talking. The words hit Ashley harder than shouting would have. Brian looked between them.
what's happening here?
Janet's jaw tightened. Mr. Brooks is the CEO of Brooks Global Freight. Silence. Absolute silence. Even the airport noise outside the window seemed to disappear for a moment. Ashley stared at Ethan, then at the gym bag, the running shoes, the sweat-stained shirt. Her brain rejected the image. Because people like Ethan were not supposed to look ordinary in her world. Power was supposed to announce itself. Tailored suits, private drivers, luxury watches, not marathon medals and dusty sneakers. That's impossible, Ashley whispered. Ethan finally spoke. No, what's impossible is how long this continued after you verified my ticket. Ashley's breathing changed, shorter now.
Faster.
Brian shifted uncomfortably. Sir, if there's been a misunderstanding. Laura Bennett cut in sharply. The doctor stepped forward, eyes blazing now. You publicly humiliated this man for nearly an hour. Brian lifted his hands defensively. We were following security procedures. Officer Ruiz spoke before Ethan could answer. No documented security violation was ever identified. That landed hard, because now it was official. Not opinion, not emotion, fact. Walter Hayes slowly shook his head. I spent 40 years teaching teenagers how to treat people with dignity, he said quietly. And somehow adults still struggle with it. Ashley looked around the room. Nobody was on her side anymore. Not even Brian completely. Not Janet. Not the passengers. Not the cameras. Especially not the cameras. Dylan checked the live stream again. 37,000 viewers. Local reporters were entering the comments now. Someone had already clipped Ashley saying people wandering in from the public terminal. Another clip showed her saying, we maintain standards. Dylan realized this was no longer internet drama. This was evidence. Ashley saw the phones pointed at her and panic finally cracked through the armor she had worn all afternoon. I didn't mean anything racial, she said quickly. Nobody answered, because intent no longer mattered as much as impact. Ethan rested one hand lightly against the back of the chair beside him. You know the strange thing? He said quietly. The room listened immediately. I ran the Denver Marathon this morning for a Children's Cardiac Foundation. Ashley stared at him. Ethan continued. We raised over $2 million for treatment programs in rural hospitals. Laura Bennett's face changed. She recognized the foundation name immediately. Her own hospital had benefited from those grants 2 years earlier. Ethan looked around the lounge slowly. I came in here exhausted, sore, probably smelling like road salt and sweat. A faint smile crossed his face. Not exactly luxury lounge material. A few uncomfortable faces lowered toward the floor. But I paid for the same seat everyone else here paid for. His eyes settled on Ashley again. And somewhere between my boarding pass and my skin color, that stopped mattering. Nobody moved. Nobody even reached for a drink. The weight of the truth sat too heavily in the room now. Janet exhaled slowly. Mr. Brooks, on behalf of Skylink Airlines, I sincerely apologize. Ethan nodded once, polite, controlled, but distant. The kind of distance people create after trust has already been damaged. Then another sound interrupted the silence. A low mechanical roar outside the windows. Several passengers turned instinctively. Bright landing lights cut through the evening sky beyond the runway. Dylan moved closer to the glass with his phone still recording. A sleek white aircraft rolled slowly toward the private terminal area beside the runway. Long body, silver stripe, custom tail number. Then the logo became visible beneath the airport lights. Brooks Global Freight. Gasps spread across the lounge. Ashley's face lost what little color remained. Walter Hayes muttered softly under his breath, Lord have mercy. The jet continued taxiing slowly across the tarmac like a final answer nobody in the room could argue with anymore. Dylan whispered into the live stream microphone, "That's his plane." Thousands of comments exploded instantly. Ashley took one small step backward, then another, because reality was collapsing around her faster than she could process it. Not just because Ethan was wealthy, not because he was powerful, but because she suddenly understood the deeper humiliation. This man never needed her approval to belong there. He had simply wanted the same thing every other passenger wanted: basic respect. And she had denied it to him before she ever knew his name. Ethan looked through the glass toward the aircraft waiting under the runway lights. Then he spoke quietly. "That plane isn't the important part." Nobody interrupted him. "The important part is this." He turned back toward the room. "If I wasn't wealthy, if I didn't own that aircraft, would any of this have changed?" No one answered, because every person in the lounge already knew the truth. Nobody in the lounge spoke for several long seconds. The silence had changed again. Earlier, it had been tense. Now it felt exposed, like the entire room had been forced to look directly at something uncomfortable about the world outside those airport windows. Ashley Morgan stood frozen near the reception counter, her shoulders tight, eyes fixed somewhere near the floor. She could feel people looking at her differently now, not as an authority figure, as a warning. Brian Cooper loosened his grip on the radio attached to his belt. His face had gone pale beneath the harsh overhead lights. He had spent years believing instincts made him good at his job. But standing there now, he realized something painful. Instincts built from bias still create damage. Officer Daniel Ruiz watched both of them carefully, not with satisfaction, with disappointment, because this situation never needed police, never needed security, never needed humiliation. It needed one simple thing:
Someone willing to say, he belongs here too.
Janet Collins finally stepped closer to Ethan. "Mr. Brooks," she said carefully, "I would like to escort you personally to a private area while we address this internally." Ethan looked at her calmly. "No." Janet blinked. "No? I've spent the last hour being questioned publicly." Ethan's voice remained level. "I'm not interested in disappearing privately now that my title makes everyone uncomfortable." Several passengers lowered their eyes, because he was right. If Ethan Brooks had been an ordinary, middle-class black man in running clothes, there would have been no apologies, no executive concern, no careful tone.
Just removal.
That truth sat heavily over the lounge like smoke. Dylan Parker adjusted his live stream again, trying to steady his breathing. He had never expected his phone to become part of a national conversation. Notifications were exploding across the screen now. Civil rights attorneys, local reporters, a Denver news producer asking for permission to use the footage. One message stood out: "This is not about one airport. This is America." Dylan read it twice, and deep down he knew it was true. Ashley suddenly spoke, her voice brittle. "I said I was sorry." Ethan turned toward her slowly. For the first time since the confrontation began, Ashley looked small. Not physically, morally. She looked like someone watching the image she had built of herself collapse in real time. Ethan studied her face carefully before answering. "No," he said quietly, "you became afraid." The words cut deeper because they were not cruel. They were honest. Ashley swallowed hard. "That's not fair." Ethan nodded once. "You're right. Fair would have been treating me like everyone else when I walked in." The room went silent again. Walter Hayes slowly sat back down in his chair, rubbing one hand across his mouth. He had spent decades watching people confuse politeness with decency. Tonight he was watching the difference unfold under airport lighting and smartphone cameras. Laura Bennett folded her arms tighter. In medicine, she had seen patients ignored because of race, pain dismissed, symptoms questioned, voices minimized. The setting was different now. The mechanism was the same. A person forced to prove humanity before receiving respect. Janet turned sharply toward Ashley and Brian. "I need both of you in my office immediately after this." Ashley's face tightened. "Janet, no," Janet snapped quietly. Not another word. That tone changed everything. Ashley finally understood this was no longer salvageable. Brian stared toward the windows where Ethan's jet remained parked beneath the glowing runway lights. He felt embarrassed, but worse than embarrassed, exposed. Because deep down, he had known the boarding pass was valid almost from the beginning, yet he kept pushing, not because of evidence. Because something about Ethan had made him suspicious before Ethan ever spoke, and now thousands of strangers online had watched that happen in real time. Officer Ruiz stepped beside Ethan.
You handled this with more patience than most people would.
Ethan gave a tired smile. That's because some of us learn early that losing our temper becomes part of the story. Ruiz looked at him carefully. He understood exactly what Ethan meant. An angry black man becomes the headline, not the reason he became angry. The older officer exhaled slowly. That's a heavy thing to carry. Ethan glanced around the lounge. You'd be surprised how many people carry it every day. Near the counter, Isabella Torres quietly wiped tears from the corners of her eyes before anyone noticed. Not because Ethan turned out to be rich, because for one brief moment, someone had finally said out loud what workers like her had seen for years. How quickly dignity changes depending on who people think deserves it. Ethan noticed her standing there. You spoke up when it mattered, he told her. Isabella shook her head slightly. I almost didn't, but you did. That landed hard in her chest. Because courage rarely feels heroic in the moment. Usually, it feels dangerous. The lounge doors opened again and two men in dark suits entered quickly from the terminal hallway. Corporate executives. Skylink Regional Operations. Both holding phones, both visibly tense. One approached Janet immediately and whispered something into her ear. Janet's expression tightened further. The live stream had reached national news. Already. Ashley heard the words and looked physically ill. The executive turned toward Ethan. Mr. Brooks, I'm Thomas Reed, Regional Vice President for Skylink Airlines. Ethan nodded politely. Thomas extended a hand carefully. Ethan shook it once. Nothing more. Thomas cleared his throat. We are deeply sorry for what occurred here today. This behavior does not reflect our company values. Walter Hayes muttered quietly from his chair. Funny how company values always show up after cameras do. Several people nearby nodded. Thomas heard him, and he could not argue with it. Ethan looked around the room one more time. At the passengers, at the employees, at Ashley standing isolated near the counter. Then he said something nobody expected. I don't need special treatment. His voice was calm, measured, steady. I needed equal treatment. No one interrupted. Because that sentence carried more weight than the jet outside, more weight than the title on the business card, more weight than the money everyone suddenly cared about. Equal treatment. Simple words, still somehow difficult for people to give away freely. Outside the windows, the runway lights stretched across the darkening evening sky like endless lines disappearing into the distance. And inside the lounge, people sat quietly with the uncomfortable realization that the most powerful thing Ethan Brooks had revealed that night was not his wealth. It was their own assumptions. Thomas Reed's phone would not stop vibrating. One call after another. Corporate communications, legal department, national media, executive leadership. He silenced the device and looked at Ethan Brooks again with the careful expression of a man trying to prevent a corporate disaster from becoming irreversible. But deep down, Thomas already knew something important. This situation was beyond public relations now, because the people inside the lounge had witnessed it with their own eyes. No press release could erase that. Ashley Morgan stood motionless near the counter, staring at the polished floor beneath her heels. Her breathing had become shallow. She could feel every phone camera in the room, even when she could not see them directly. For the first time in years, she felt powerless. Not because Ethan was wealthy, because she no longer controlled the story. Brian Cooper looked worse. Years working security had taught him to trust authority, uniforms, instinct. But tonight those instincts had led him straight into public humiliation. And somewhere underneath the embarrassment, something else was beginning to grow. Shame.
Real shame.
Officer Daniel Ruiz noticed it immediately. He had seen many people become defensive when exposed. Brian was becoming quiet instead. That mattered. Janet Collins stepped aside with Thomas Reed near the lounge entrance. Their voices stayed low, but the tension around them was visible. This is already everywhere, Thomas whispered. Janet rubbed one hand against her temple. How bad? CNN Denver affiliate picked it up 15 minutes ago. Somebody clipped the live stream. Civil rights groups are reposting it. Janet closed her eyes briefly. Years in airport operations had taught her one brutal truth. Most corporate crises were not caused by mistakes. They were caused by people refusing to stop after the mistake became obvious. Across the lounge, Ethan finally sat down again, slowly, carefully, like a man whose body had started feeling the weight of the marathon and the confrontation at the same time. Laura Bennett noticed the slight stiffness in his movements immediately. "You're injured," she said softly. Ethan shook his head, just exhausted. "You should hydrate." A faint smile crossed his face.
Doctor's orders?
Laura gave the smallest nod. For the first time all evening, the tension around Ethan eased slightly. Not gone, just softened. Isabella quickly stepped behind the counter and returned with a bottle of water. This time she carried it differently, not as an employee serving a customer, as one human being trying to care for another. Ethan accepted it quietly. "Thank you." Ashley watched that exchange and something inside her twisted painfully. Because hours earlier she had looked at Ethan and seen threat, suspicion, disruption, and now everyone else in the room seemed to see the same thing. A tired man who had simply wanted to sit down before his flight. Walter Hayes leaned back in his chair and looked around the lounge. "You know what scares me?" he said quietly. Several nearby passengers looked toward him. Walter folded his weathered hands together. "If this happened to him," he nodded toward Ethan, "imagine what happens to people without money, without cameras, without witnesses willing to speak." Nobody answered because everyone understood. Dylan Parker lowered his phone for the first time in nearly an hour. His arm was shaking from holding it up so long. He glanced at Ethan. "You know," Dylan said carefully, "people online keep calling this a victory story." Ethan looked at him.
And what do you think?
Dylan hesitated. "I think it would have been a better story if none of this happened." That answer made Ethan smile again. A real smile this time. Small, tired, but genuine. "Then you're probably going to become a good journalist." Dylan felt his throat tighten unexpectedly, because all night Ethan had refused to turn cruelty into performance. No screaming, no threats, no showing off, just truth, steady truth. Thomas Reed finally approached again, carrying the tension of an executive walking into consequences he could not control.
Mr.
"Brooks," he said carefully, "our executive office would like to arrange transportation and accommodations immediately. We would also like to discuss formal corrective actions regarding everyone involved." Ashley flinched visibly at the phrase corrective actions. Brian looked away. Ethan took a slow drink of water before answering. "You should discuss corrective actions regardless of whether I ever answer another phone call from your company." Thomas nodded once. "We will." Ethan held his gaze. "Will you?" Thomas did not answer immediately. That silence told the truth more honestly than words could, because both men understood something painful about institutions. Companies often change behavior only after public embarrassment forced them to, not before. Officer Ruiz stepped toward Brian quietly. "You should probably write your incident report now, while details are fresh." Brian swallowed hard. "What exactly am I supposed to write?" Ruiz looked at him carefully. "The truth." That word seemed to hang in the air. Truth. Simple. Heavy. Expensive. Brian rubbed one hand across the back of his neck. For the first time all evening, he looked directly at Ethan. Not through him, not at his clothes, not at his race. At him. "I was wrong," Brian said quietly. The lounge fell silent again. Ashley stared at him in disbelief. Brian continued, voice rougher now. "I made assumptions before I had facts. And once I made them, I kept defending them instead of stopping." No one interrupted, because accountability sounds different from apology. Apologies often protect pride. Accountability costs something. Ethan studied Brian for several long seconds. Then he nodded once. "That matters more than you think." Ashley looked between them, confused and cornered. "You're just going to forgive him?" Ethan turned toward her. "This isn't about forgiveness." His voice stayed calm. "It's about whether people are willing to learn after causing harm." Ashley's eyes filled suddenly, though she fought hard against it, because somewhere beneath the fear of losing her career, beneath the humiliation, beneath the cameras, she was starting to realize something unbearable. She had not seen Ethan Brooks as fully human when he first walked through those lounge doors, and now she could never unknow that about herself. Outside the windows, the Brooks Global freight jet remained parked beneath the runway lights, quiet and motionless against the dark Colorado evening. But inside the lounge, the real shift had nothing to do with wealth anymore. It was happening inside people, one realization at a time. The television above the lounge bar switched from a financial news segment to breaking coverage from Denver International Airport. Several passengers turned towards the screen at the exact same moment. Dylan Parker's live stream footage now filled the monitor. Ashley Morgan's voice echoed softly through the lounge speakers. This section is reserved for premium passengers, not people wandering in from the public terminal. The room froze. Hearing it again made it worse. On television, stripped of adrenaline and tension, the words sounded colder than anyone remembered. A red banner rolled across the bottom of the screen. Airline discrimination incident goes viral at Denver Airport. Ashley covered her mouth with one trembling hand. Brian Cooper lowered his eyes. Thomas Reed looked physically sick. The national feed replayed another clip. What exactly about my appearance makes you think I don't belong here? Then silence. Then Ashley saying, "We maintain standards." Walter Hayes slowly shook his head. That sentence is going to follow this company for years. No one disagreed. Near the windows, Ethan remained seated with the same quiet composure he had carried since the beginning. But exhaustion was finally catching him now. His shoulders sagged slightly. One hand rested against his knee where the marathon strain had tightened his muscles. Laura Bennett noticed again. "You need food," she said firmly. Ethan gave a tired laugh. "I was actually trying to eat before all this started." That line hit the room unexpectedly hard, because everyone suddenly imagined the simplest version of the evening. A man finishing a marathon, buying a first-class ticket, walking into a lounge, looking for a meal and a place to sit. That was all, and somehow it had become this. Isabella quietly disappeared behind the counter and returned carrying a tray. Chicken soup, bread, fruit, water. She set it gently on the table beside Ethan. He looked up at her.
You don't have to do that.
"Yes," Isabella said softly. "I think I do." The room watched carefully as Ethan picked up the spoon. Small moment, simple moment, but after nearly 2 hours of confrontation, it felt deeply human. Not CEO, not scandal, not headlines, just a tired man finally being treated with care. Ashley saw it too, and the shame deepened inside her. Because kindness had been available from the beginning, it would have cost nothing. Thomas Reed's phone rang again. This time he answered immediately and stepped aside, lowering his voice. "Yes, sir. I understand. No, the footage is worse than we initially thought. Yes, he's still here." Thomas listened for several seconds before his posture stiffened. "I'll tell him." When he ended the call, he looked toward Ethan carefully. That was Skylink's chief executive officer. The room turned silent again. "He would like to speak with you personally." Ethan set the spoon down slowly. "Tonight?" "Yes." Ethan leaned back slightly. "I'm sure he does." Thomas hesitated. "He's also ordered an immediate internal investigation." Walter muttered quietly. "They investigate after embarrassment. Never before." Thomas heard him again, and again he could not argue. Ashley suddenly spoke through trembling breath. "I never hated you." Every eye shifted toward her. Ashley looked directly at Ethan now, tears finally spilling despite her effort to hold them back.
I need you to know that.
Ethan studied her quietly. Then he answered with painful calm. "I believe you." Ashley looked confused for a moment. Then Ethan continued. "That's what makes this harder." Silence spread through the lounge once more. "You didn't wake up this morning planning to humiliate someone," Ethan said. "You made fast assumptions, then protected those assumptions because admitting you were wrong became harder than continuing to harm." Ashley stared at him because every word felt true, and truth spoken gently can hurt more than anger. Brian Cooper slowly sat down in a chair near the wall, elbows on his knees, rubbing both hands across his face. He looked older now. Officer Ruiz walked over quietly. "You okay?" Brian let out a rough breath. "No." Ruiz nodded once. "That's probably the first honest thing you felt all night." Brian gave a weak laugh that almost broke in the middle. "I spent years telling rookies not to profile people." He shook his head slowly. "Didn't even realize I was doing it." Ruiz looked toward Ethan. "That's the thing about bias. Most people think it always arrives screaming." Brian followed his gaze. But sometimes it just sounds like procedure. The words sat heavily between them. Across the lounge, Dylan checked his phone again. 58,000 viewers. Hashtags everywhere now. News stations reposting clips. Former airline employees sharing stories of similar incidents. One comment caught Dylan's eye. This man stayed calm because he knew anger would become the story instead of injustice. Dylan looked at Ethan eating quietly beside the runway windows. He realized the internet was finally understanding something Ethan had known his whole life. Composure was not weakness. Sometimes it was survival. Thomas Reed approached Ethan again carefully. "Mr. Brooks, there's one more thing." Ethan looked up. "The board has requested that Ashley Morgan and Brian Cooper be placed on immediate administrative suspension pending investigation." Ashley closed her eyes. Brian looked down at the floor. No one celebrated. That was the strange thing. There was no victory feeling in the room. Only consequence. And consequences are rarely satisfying when real human beings are attached to them. Ethan remained silent for several seconds. Then he asked quietly, "Will suspension teach them anything if the culture behind it stays untouched?" Thomas had no answer, because Ethan had reached a deeper problem now. This was never only about two employees. It was about an environment where suspicion could attach itself to race before evidence ever appeared. Laura Bennett folded her arms. "My hospital had to confront this years ago," she said softly. Bias training didn't begin with hateful people. It began with ordinary people who thought they were being careful. Walter nodded slowly. "That's what scares me most. Ordinary people." Outside, snow had begun falling lightly across the Denver runway. Soft flakes drifted beneath the blue airport lights. Inside the lounge, Ethan looked around at the faces watching him. Fear, regret, reflection, embarrassment. Then his eyes settled on Isabella. She still stood near the counter, uncertain whether she had done something brave or simply endangered her career. Ethan gave her a small nod. And somehow, in that moment, that quiet acknowledgement mattered more to her than any corporate statement ever could. Snow continued falling outside the lounge windows. Soft, quiet, almost peaceful. But inside the terminal, nobody felt peaceful anymore. The television screens kept replaying the footage. Ashley's voice, Brian's demands. Ethan sitting calmly while the room slowly turned against the people accusing him. Every replay stripped away another excuse. Thomas Reed stood near the windows, speaking with corporate legal advisors through an earpiece. His expression grew tighter with every sentence he heard. "Yes," he said quietly. "I understand. No, there was no security violation documented. Yes, multiple witnesses. Yes, the live stream is archived." He closed his eyes briefly, then ended the call. Janet Collins noticed immediately.
How bad?
Thomas gave a hollow laugh. "We're trending nationwide." Ashley sat down heavily in one of the leather chairs nearby, not because she wanted comfort, because her legs no longer trusted themselves. She stared at the television screen, replaying her own face. For years, she had believed professionalism meant maintaining order, enforcing standards, protecting the premium experience. Now she was seeing herself through the eyes of strangers, and strangers were calling it racism. That word echoed inside her chest like something heavy falling through water. Officer Ruiz sat across from Brian Cooper quietly. Neither man spoke for a while. Finally, Brian looked up. "You know the worst part?" Ruiz waited. Brian rubbed both hands slowly together. "I really thought I was being responsible." Ruiz nodded once. "That's why bias survives." Brian frowned. "Because people mean well? Because people stop questioning themselves once they think they're the good guy." The words stayed with Brian, heavy, sharp, impossible to dodge. Across the room, Ethan finally finished the soup Isabella had brought him. The warmth had helped slightly, but exhaustion still sat deep behind his eyes. Dylan Parker approached carefully with his phone lowered now. "Mr. Brooks?" Ethan looked up. Dylan hesitated. He suddenly looked very young again. Not a live streamer, not a journalist. Just a college kid standing near a man whose entire life experience suddenly felt bigger than anything taught in a classroom. "I wanted to ask something," Dylan said quietly. Ethan nodded.
Why didn't you tell them who you were sooner?
Several people nearby listened carefully. Ethan leaned back slightly in the chair. "Because I needed to know whether they respected human dignity or social status." Silence. Dylan swallowed hard, And if they had apologized before finding out. Ethan looked toward Ashley and Brian briefly. Then tonight would have ended very differently. That answer settled heavily over the room because everyone understood what he meant. This was never really about the title on the business card. The title only exposed the truth faster. Laura Bennett looked down at her hands thoughtfully. In medicine, she said softly, "We teach students that first impressions can kill people." Several heads turned toward her. Laura continued, "You assume someone is exaggerating pain because of race. You assume someone is uneducated because of how they speak. You assume someone is dangerous because of how they look." She shook her head slowly. Eventually, those assumptions become habits, and habits become systems. Walter Hayes nodded from across the lounge. That's exactly how schools fail kids, too. The room had changed completely now. Earlier, it felt divided. Now it felt reflective. People were no longer watching a confrontation. They were examining themselves inside it. Ashley heard every word, and each sentence made her feel smaller. She looked toward Ethan carefully. "When you walked in," she said quietly, "I made a judgment before you even spoke." Ethan met her eyes. Ashley's voice cracked slightly. "I don't know when I became someone who does that." Nobody moved. Nobody interrupted, because this no longer sounded like self-defense. It sounded like grief. The grief of realizing you failed your own idea of yourself. Ethan answered gently. "Most people don't notice bias when it feels normal around them." Ashley lowered her eyes. "That doesn't excuse it." "No," Ethan agreed. "But understanding it is the only way people change it." Thomas Reed approached again, this time holding a folder and a tablet. "Mr. Brooks," he said carefully, "Skylink leadership would like to formally request a meeting with you in Chicago next week regarding corrective policy measures." Ethan gave a tired smile. "You move quickly when money gets involved." Thomas looked ashamed. "Yes," he admitted quietly, "probably too quickly for the wrong reasons." That honesty surprised Ethan slightly. Thomas continued, "But for what it's worth, some people inside the company have been trying to raise concerns about profiling complaints for years." Janet glanced toward him sharply. Thomas sighed. "We just never paid attention until something exploded publicly." Walter let out a bitter breath. That's America in one sentence. No one argued with him. Outside, Ethan's jet crew moved beneath the runway lights, preparing for departure. The aircraft gleamed against the snow-covered tarmac like a symbol of wealth and power. Yet strangely, nobody in the lounge seemed focused on the plane anymore. Not even Dylan. Because the most important thing in the room was no longer Ethan's success. It was the realization that respect should never require proof of importance. Officer Ruiz stood and adjusted his jacket. "My shift ends in 20 minutes, he said quietly. "But I'm glad I stayed." Ethan looked at him. "You were the first person who asked for facts instead of assumptions." Ruiz gave a small nod. "My father taught me something when I became a cop." Ethan waited. Ruiz glanced around the lounge. He said the easiest thing in the world is to mistake confidence for truth. Brian lowered his head slowly, because he knew exactly what Ruiz meant. Ashley suddenly stood. Everyone looked toward her. She walked slowly toward Ethan. No authority left in her posture now. No performance. No image management. Just a human being carrying regret. She stopped a few feet away. "I don't expect forgiveness," she said quietly. Ethan remained silent. Ashley took a shaky breath. "But I hope someday I become better than the person I was tonight." The lounge stayed still. And for the first time all evening, Ethan's expression softened not from exhaustion, but from compassion. Ethan Brooks looked at Ashley Morgan for a long moment before answering. The lounge had become so quiet that even the soft hum of the heating vent sounded loud beneath the tension. Snow drifted steadily outside the massive runway windows now, covering the Denver tarmac in thin white layers under the blue airport lights. Ashley stood motionless in front of him. No badge. No authority. No control. Just regret. Ethan finally nodded once. "Then don't waste this moment." Ashley's eyes filled again. He continued quietly, "Because embarrassment fades. Public attention fades. But if you walk away from tonight without changing anything inside yourself, then none of this meant anything." Ashley lowered her head. For the first time all evening, nobody looked at her with anger anymore, only reflection. Because everyone in that lounge understood something difficult now. Most harm does not come from monsters. It comes from ordinary people who stop questioning their assumptions. Officer Daniel Ruiz checked his watch slowly. His shift was technically over, but he stayed. Walter Hayes stayed too. Laura Bennett stayed. Even passengers whose flights had already begun boarding remained seated near the windows, watching the strange emotional gravity that had settled over the room. Dylan Parker ended the live stream at last. The screen went black. Almost instantly, his phone exploded with missed calls and messages from news producers, journalists, podcast hosts, and media outlets across the country. But Dylan barely looked at any of it. Instead, he stared at Ethan, at the marathon medal still hanging around his neck, at the quiet exhaustion in his posture, and Dylan realized something he would remember for the rest of his life. The strongest person in the room had been the man who never needed to raise his voice. Thomas Reed approached Ethan again carefully. "Mr. Brooks, transportation to your aircraft is ready whenever you'd like." Ethan glanced toward the windows. The Brooks Global Freight Jet sat waiting beneath the falling snow, lights glowing softly against the dark Colorado night. But Ethan did not stand immediately. Instead, he looked around the lounge one last time, at Isabella Torres behind the counter, at Brian Cooper sitting silently with his elbows on his knees, at Ashley Morgan trying to hold herself together, at ordinary travelers who had become witnesses to something larger than themselves. Then Ethan spoke quietly. "You know what the worst part of nights like this is?" Nobody interrupted. "It teaches people to wear masks." The room stayed still. Ethan's voice remained calm, measured, heavy. "You learn to overdress so nobody questions you. You learn to smile carefully, speak carefully, move carefully." He looked down briefly at his running clothes, and eventually you start wondering whether people respect you or just the version of you that makes them comfortable. Laura Bennett felt her throat tighten. Walter slowly removed his glasses. Even Thomas Reed lowered his eyes, because deep down, they all understood what Ethan meant. The burden of constantly managing how others perceive your humanity. Ethan looked toward Dylan. "That's why this mattered." Dylan frowned slightly. "Because people recorded it? Because people finally stopped looking away." That sentence settled across the lounge like warmth after a storm. For years, many people in that room had witnessed smaller moments, quiet moments, uncomfortable moments, a suspicious glance, a tighter grip on a purse, a different tone of voice, extra scrutiny that somehow always landed on certain people more than others. Most of the time, everyone stayed silent. Tonight they did not, and that changed something. Officer Ruiz finally stood. "I should head home." Brian looked up at him slowly. Ruiz rested one hand briefly against Brian's shoulder. "What matters now is what you do after this." Brian nodded weakly, not defensive anymore, just humbled. Ashley wiped beneath her eyes carefully before speaking again. "I really am sorry." Ethan studied her for a second. Then he said something she did not expect.
I know.
Ashley blinked. Ethan leaned slightly forward. People who enjoy cruelty don't usually break apart afterward. The words hit her hard, not because they excused her, because they challenged her to become better. And deep down, Ashley realized that was harder than punishment. Punishment ends. Growth does not. Janet Collins stepped closer with a tired expression. "We'll be implementing mandatory bias review and procedural reform immediately," she said quietly. "Not because legal told us to, because tonight exposed something ugly." Walter Hayes gave a slow nod. "That's how change starts. Not with comfort, with exposure." Thomas Reed exhaled heavily. "Our board will probably spend weeks talking about reputation damage." Ethan gave a faint smile. "Then maybe someone should talk about human damage too." Silence again. Heavy silence, the kind that forces people to think. Outside, airport workers guided baggage carts through the snow while jets moved slowly across the glowing runway. Somewhere in the distance, another boarding announcement echoed through the terminal speakers. Life continuing, people traveling, families reuniting, workers finishing long shifts. And inside one airport lounge, a group of strangers had been forced to confront something America often preferred to leave hidden beneath politeness. Bias rarely announces itself loudly anymore. Sometimes it wears professionalism, policy, procedure, standards. That was what made it dangerous. Ethan finally stood, slowly. his body still stiff from the marathon and the emotional weight of the evening. Isabella stepped around the counter instinctively. "Do you need help carrying anything?" Ethan smiled gently. "I think I'm all right." But before he picked up his gym bag, he paused beside her. "You protected someone when it wasn't safe for you to do it." Isabella looked down briefly. "I was scared. So was everyone else." That answer stayed with her, because courage had never meant the absence of fear, only the decision that something else mattered more. Dylan stepped forward awkwardly.
Mr. Brooks.
Ethan turned. Dylan hesitated, then finally asked the thing that had been sitting in his chest all night. "How do you stay that calm?" Ethan looked toward the snowy runway outside the glass. When he answered, his voice was softer than before. "My father used to tell me something when I was young." The lounge listened carefully. He said, "The world will try to convince you that anger is your identity." Ethan paused. "Don't hand people your dignity just because they fail to recognize it." Nobody spoke afterward, because some truths arrive quietly and still leave an entire room changed. Ethan picked up his gym bag, the same simple black bag Ashley Morgan had judged the moment he walked through those doors. Then he started toward the exit leading to the private terminal. As he passed Brian Cooper, Brian stood immediately, not out of fear, out of respect. Ethan gave him a small nod and kept walking. As he passed Ashley, she whispered softly, "Thank you for not destroying us." Ethan stopped for half a second, then answered without turning around. "That was never the point." The automatic doors opened. Cold winter air swept briefly into the lounge. Snowflakes drifted beneath the runway lights as Ethan Brooks walked across the tarmac toward the waiting jet. Not like a billionaire, not like a celebrity, just a tired man carrying himself with dignity after the world tried to strip it away. And behind him, inside that lounge, people sat in silence knowing they had witnessed more than a viral moment. They had witnessed the difference between power and character. One can be purchased. The other is revealed under pressure. If this story stayed with you, take a moment to like the video and subscribe to the channel, because stories like this remind us that respect should never depend on status, money, or appearance. And if you believe dignity matters for every person in every room, comment these 3 words below: never stay silent.